Hi, Shadi.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Great. Good to see you again on Blogging Heads.
Good to see you. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV. You are Shadi Hamid of the Brookings Institution Saban Center, where you are a fellow. For a while, you were based in Doha, right? Running their kind of Doha thing, but you're back in D.C.
Yeah, I was directing the research program at the Brookings Doha
Mm-hmm.
Center. I just moved back about 3 months ago, so good to be back in the U.S. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So the reason we're speaking is because you have a new book out with Oxford University Press, Temptations of Power, Islamists and Illiberal Democracy in a New Middle East. Um, and I think it speaks pretty directly to the question of how depressed we should or should not be at the way the Arab Spring has turned out to date. Because it's about broadly the question of whether Islamism and democracy can coexist in the long run. We saw an experiment in Egypt where the Muslim Brotherhood, an Islamist party, held power. Didn't last real long, and there's kind of I think it's hard to find a country where there's an unqualified success story. Um, and just briefly, I think it's fair to say that to the question of whether Islamism and democracy can coexist, um, your answer is yes, but with an asterisk that some people may find unsettling, right?
Exactly. So I'm trying to problematize the notion that good things go together. In our own history, liberalism and democracy did go hand in hand. So when I think a lot of Americans use the word democracy, they're really talking about liberal democracy. But in the Middle East, we see something a little bit different that democracy brings to power Islamist groups in many of these cases. They may be committed to democracy, and I argue that for the most part they are, but they pursue illiberal objectives through the democratic process. And that's where you really get this tension. And a lot of the really existential divides that you see in the region now are over how do you incorporate Islamist groups in existing secular state systems, where a lot of liberal elites feel very threatened by the rise of Islamists through the democratic process.
Mm-hmm. So, right at the top, let's get clear on two terms. One is a term that I think should probably be defined more often, certainly when it's used like on CNN and Fox, which is the term Islamist. And I think many Americans have no clear idea. Like they hear that Al Qaeda is Islamist, and they think it means like people who want to kill you or something. So, what is your definition of Islamist?
Islamists are individuals or groups that see a prominent role for Islam and Islamic law in public and political life. Now, that's a broad definition, and it includes many different actors within that. You can have violent Islamists, non-violent ones. Actually, the vast majority of Islamist movements do not use violence and do participate in the democratic process.
Mm-hmm.
We can talk about Salafis, who believe in a more kind of textual literalist
Mm-hmm.
understanding of Islam, or the more mainstream Islamist groups like the Muslim Brotherhood.
Mm-hmm. But it is the idea that government, at a minimum, should be informed by Islamic values. Often, what they have in mind is a very explicit grounding in Sharia law, in some sense of that kind of ambiguous term. But I guess by your definition, the Egyptian constitution as it existed before the Muslim Brotherhood took power had
Mm.
some reference, right, to how government should be based on values of Sharia, or something very
Yeah.
vague, and that would that already qualify as Islamism?
So no, I wouldn't say that it's just about being informed by Islam
Okay.
or Islamic law, because the vast majority of, say, Egyptians do actually see a role for Islam. Even so-called liberals or secularists
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't necessarily say that Islam has to be privatized. So it's a little bit, the bar is a little bit higher, and that's why I would use the word central. They see a central role for Islam and Islamic law, that it's very much at the center of their political program, of their electoral advocacy. This is what they're about. Is more mixing of religion and politics, not less, and that's a priority for them.
So then, would the current Turkish government be Islamist in your view? Though,
So I mean,
as it is governed, I mean.
I mean, generally we don't call the Turkish Islamists because they essentially gave up the idea of an Islamic state or even having Islamic law as part of their program. So a lot of people would say that they're Islamically oriented or they're neo-Islamists or conservative Democrats. But if we want to be really technical, I don't think it's quite accurate to call them Islamist, although they are from the same school of thought that the Muslim Brotherhood is, but they've evolved in quite a different way.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And you're saying that it looks like Islamists, when they participate in democracy, are going to tend to steer democracy in an illiberal direction. So tell us what you mean by illiberal democracy as opposed to liberal democracy.
Yeah, so pretty much one of the main arguments I make is kind of contrary to the popular wisdom. Democratization doesn't push Islamists to the center, as you might expect, but actually pushes them further to the right in an illiberal direction. And by that I mean illiberalism can take a variety of forms, some of them more explicit than others. A few examples: restricting alcohol consumption, restricting the use of interest in the banking system, segregating the sexes on the primary or secondary school levels. But even more generally than that, in a kind of metaphysical sense, they see the state as promoting a particular conception of religion. So the state is not supposed to be ideologically or religiously neutral. The state is an important part of fashioning this virtuous society. Now, Islamists themselves aren't very clear on how a lot of this works because, for the most part, there's not a lot of models, there isn't a lot of experience to draw on. But that general thrust, I think, is quite clear. And that's pretty much the point. And part of what I try to argue in the book is, for Islamists to be Islamists, they have to believe in a philosophical alternative to liberal democracy. That's sort of the point. So Islamists, by definition, are at least somewhat illiberal. That's why we call them Islamists. So it's, if that makes sense.
Well, maybe a little elaboration just on the term liberal. First of all, you don't mean it in the kind of contemporary American sense of just on the left. You're referring to the extent of choice that is granted in individual decisions of a kind of a normative kind or something, right? I mean,
exactly. So yeah, that's worth clarifying. So what I'm talking about here is certain non-negotiable rights and freedoms that liberals or classical liberals are supposed to believe in, and that has to do with the kind of autonomy of the individual, the idea that elected majorities can't infringe on certain inalienable rights. So that can take a number of different forms, but that's kind of what we're talking about.
But by that definition, hasn't America had sustained bursts of illiberalism? I mean, for a while, the consumption of alcohol was outlawed. It was illegal to like be a homosexual in various states, right? And I could go on and on. Does that mean that we used to be illiberal, but now we're liberal, or isn't it more the case that it's kind of a moving target, and different cultures define these things differently?
Precisely. This isn't brand new. It's not as if illiberal democracy is a new term we need to use for the Middle East. It actually even draws, I mean, the term itself draws on Fareed Zakaria's work, his book Future of Freedom, where he talked about illiberal democracy, not primarily in the context of the Middle East, but more generally, including in the U.S. even. So every society comes up with it, has to try to resolve this tension between what elected majorities want and the rights of the individual. So it's kind of a continuum. And I would say that Western democracies have this tension, but there's generally much more protection and ensuring of rights than in, say, developing countries in the Middle East or in Asia. So there's certainly different degrees, but it's not as if we haven't dealt with this in our own history, because we most certainly have. Even today, I would point to efforts to ban abortion in certain southern states, or discriminating against the gay community in a variety of different ways. There are still a number of cases where the rights of the individual are circumscribed.
Right. And so all this suggests that, first of all, it could be very fluid in the Arab world as well. I mean, you could see evolution. You could see... I guess my question is, why would we expect... I guess it's just not clear to me that Islamists are kind of qualitatively different in the way I think your thesis suggests. That there's some essential property of Islamism that is in these parties and will forever be, as opposed to it being the case that right now they actually reflect values that are pretty prevalent in their society, and as time goes on and values change, they will reflect those changes as well, kind of as was the case in the United States. Does that make sense?
Yes, that would be one of the counter arguments, and this gets us into a little bit of controversial territory. I do think Islamists are distinctive, and for them, illiberalism is more inherent to how they see the world. But I mean, so part of the issue here is it's not just that Islamists believe certain things and they're not able to change. Mm-hmm. They're also products of deeply conservative societies.
Right.
So they have to reflect that popular sentiment. And that's one of the reasons that democratization can actually push Islamists and actually the broader society further to the right. Because what does democracy mean? It means that elected leaders have to be more responsive to popular sentiment. And popular sentiment in a lot of these countries is deeply illiberal. And just to give you, a couple of examples of this. So, when we're talking, there's a 2011 Pew poll in Egypt where large majorities believe in the stoning of adulterers, the cutting off of the hands of thieves, the death penalty for apostasy. The numbers are actually quite high. And that poll itself might be an outlier, but still, I think that that poll and others show that there is a kind of deep support for things that we as Americans aren't going to feel comfortable with. On a less extreme example of this is a March 2011 YouGov poll where only 18% of Egyptian respondents said they would support a female president. So on something like gender equality, we do see quite a big gap between where certain Arab societies are and where we are as Americans. So,
Sure.
The question is how... when will that change, or how does that sentiment change? Are we going to see some kind of reformation in these societies where popular sentiment changes in a drastic way? I would argue that the Arab world has proven somewhat immune to secularization. There have been many efforts of essentially forced secularization, particularly in the 50s and 60s, and even in Tunisia until fairly recently. Mm-hmm. But once you kind of remove that forced secularization, you see a kind of return to this religious equilibrium. Now, that gets us into, a broader debate about the nature of Islam, and is Islam as a religion distinctive from other religions? I don't want to get into that too much, but I do think because Islam has, I would say, a more kind of intense attachment to the Quranic text. Mm-hmm. So to be a Muslim, for the most part, at least from an Orthodox standpoint, you have to believe that the Quran is not just inspired by God, but is literally every single letter and word directly from God. Mm-hmm. Now, that does, I think, provide, that does introduce some challenges in how we think about the possibilities of some kind of reformation that could potentially privatize or secularize religion as occurred in Western Europe.
Yeah. So I guess, so let's look at Egypt closely. And I'll try to continue this pushback on your thesis. Not that I'm qualified to provide it, but it's a job that somebody's got to do.
Sure.
So for starters, there's another interesting kind of counterintuitive thing you're arguing that is illustrated in Egypt, which is that actually repression does not radicalize these groups, at least repression of a certain kind or at a certain level. So the repression you saw from secular governments in the 1990s and maybe early 2000s, you say actually led to a kind of pragmatic moderation on the part of Islamist parties, including in Egypt, right?
Yes, I mean, this is one of the, I suppose, controversial, if you will, arguments that I make in the book that, again, kind of contrary to the academic literature, which argues that repression generally has a radicalizing effect in these cases.
Mm-hmm.
If we look at the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and Jordan, which is the two cases that I focus on, that they actually become more moderate as repression intensifies. So part of what I tried to do in the book was try to make sense of this puzzle. This isn't what we would expect. What's going on here? Now, just to kind of clarify what I mean by moderation here, so we're talking about de-emphasizing the role of Sharia law in their political programs, embracing many of the tenets of democratic life, including popular sovereignty and alternation of power, reaching out to secular groups and forming cross-ideological coalitions, and democratizing their internal organizational structures. So on these various indicators, we do see a significant evolution over time on the part of many of these groups. Now, when I speak to audiences about this, I get a little bit uncomfortable because I know people are going to misconstrue my argument. And I've actually run into this time and time again. I'm not arguing that repression is good from a normative standpoint. Mm-hmm. I'm not arguing that there's a linear relationship between repression and moderation, meaning that if there's more repression, there will be more moderation. No, it doesn't work that way. So I try to make the distinction in the book that between low to moderate levels of repression and extreme levels of repression, what I call eradication. I am not talking about attempts to eradicate these groups.
And by the way, is what's going on in Egypt now, does that qualify as an eradication attempt in your view?
Yes. Yes, definitely.
So you would view that as likely counterproductive, leading to radicalization more likely than moderation.
Yeah, we can debate the extent of radicalization, but there will certainly be some radicalization. That's what we've already seen. We see a minority of Brotherhood members post-coup resorting to violence, or at least being more open to violence. And we've seen that before in, say, Algeria in the 1990s after the military coup there. So I just really want to make that distinction clear so people don't get the wrong idea.
Well, and we should say that you've long been a supporter of, fostering democratization in the Arab world and I guess everywhere else for that matter, and the idea that Islamists should be encouraged to participate in democracy. And I don't think you've changed those views, even if your research may have complicated them. I don't know, right?
Right, exactly. I mean, so look, as an analyst, I have to reflect what I find in my research. So when I initially started work on these issues, I had a different notion of this. I actually did believe in what's called the inclusion moderation hypothesis, that more inclusion leads to moderation. Mm-hmm. But through my research, I found something a little bit different. So I kind of went through my own evolution and understanding how Islamist groups change. And I might be a little bit uncomfortable with those results, but that's what I found, and I have to reflect that as faithfully as I can. Now, that doesn't mean I've changed my position on whether the U.S. should support democracy in the region. First of all, I believe, it's a bigger discussion of why I think democracy in the long term is good for U.S. interests and good for these societies. But I will say this, that my arguments in this book make democracy perhaps less attractive or seem less attractive to American observers. Mm-hmm. And I'll be upfront about that. Yes, democracy is less attractive because it brings to power groups that don't share many of our values as Americans. But I think we have to confront that. We have to come to terms with it. And, we can talk about that more if you'd like, of why we should come to terms with that.
Yeah. Well, let's save that for the end and come back to the Egyptian case and walk through that. Okay, so the Brotherhood actually got more moderate under moderate repression, you might say. I think, in your view, wasn't really ready to govern when it was kind of thrust into the spotlight and wound up governing, but. And, we kind of, I think most people kind of know how that happened. They did better in the elections than than people had predicted, and so on. And there they were, and you had Morsi, not Mr. Charisma, but for better or worse, he was the guy. Now, I guess I want to kind of challenge the idea that we can conclude all that much from what happened about the Brotherhood's character from what happened, and in particular that we can conclude that they wouldn't, that they would in the end firmly resist liberalism. I mean, I guess it's just not clear to me that they did anything other than an attempt, at least, at kind of short-term pragmatic accommodation, right? I mean, by your account, I think they found themselves in a situation where they had a party to their right, the Salafis, who, I don't know if they were in a formal coalition or whatever, but they had decided that kind of that was where they had to go. And in an attempt to kind of compromise with them, they alienated people kind of to a large group of people that you might say were to their left. Of course, there were also, and maybe more importantly, just the economy was going downhill. But in any event, it sounds like kind of like regular politicking, much the way the Republicans are now like trying to accommodate the Tea Party, kind of, whether or not that represents their true beliefs. I mean, it seems like what we saw was their attempt to hold together a coalition didn't work. Why should it be interpreted any other way, if you see what I mean?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think you're right that we have to be careful about the conclusions we draw from just 1 year. Mm-hmm. That's really all we have to go on in terms of their time in power. So I would say that the Muslim Brotherhood veered to the right, certainly when it came to their Islamist rhetoric, also in how they oversaw the drafting of the Constitution, which included clauses that I think, are either illiberal or don't quite mesh with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So there are a number of examples of that. But I think you're right that we have to look at some of the factors there. And one of the key ones here is in a democratic opening, groups like the Muslim Brotherhood no longer have a monopoly on the conservative vote.
Right.
You see the proliferation of ultra-conservatives, of groups that are even more right-wing. So we have essentially what I call a Tea Party effect, and the Salafis drag the Brotherhood further to the right. So there was definitely that dynamic. But you're right to point out that there wasn't actually a lot in the way of tangible Islamization. So the Brotherhood didn't actually pass, with one minor exception, any explicitly Islamic laws during their time in power.
Right.
So that is definitely the case. But I also base my argument on democratic openings in previous periods. So in Egypt, I look at a small but significant democratic opening in the early to mid 1980s. Mm-hmm. And in Jordan, a more significant democratic opening from 1989 to 1993. And I track how the Brotherhood in both countries responded to those democratic openings. And we see there more tangible examples of Islamization, of trying to pass explicitly Islamic laws through the parliamentary process, so on and so forth. If we really wanted to extend it, we could even say that in Turkey today, although I don't really discuss this much in the book because it's quite recent, we see the AK party there, I would say, veering to the right. So the longer the democratic process has gone on in Turkey, the AK party hasn't moved to the center. If anything, they're doubling down on their conservative base and actually alienating the secular opposition more and more.
But are you referring mainly to the authoritarianism or to the religious stuff per se?
I'm talking more about the social and religious stuff of trying to bring religion more into the public sphere.
When you look at what they're actually doing, it doesn't seem to me radical, even by Americans. It's like they want liquor stores to close earlier, right? No, seriously. I mean, it's just not radical stuff. And they want women to be allowed to wear headscarves at universities. That's actually a move toward liberalism in a certain sense, right? Whereas the secular, Kemalist history had banned, headscarves and then, I don't see them as qualitatively different from, say, the religious right in America in terms of like what they want and I don't know.
You're right, but they do have an interest in changing the nature of the state. And keep in mind, they're starting from a totally different premise. I mean, the Turkish constitution is aggressively secularist in a way our constitution never has been. So I'm just saying, relative to where the Turkish state has been, they want to push the country in a different direction. We can now have a debate about whether that's good.
In some ways, that is toward liberal, actually. But although I grant you, he's being like a totally creepy authoritarian lately. And, although on the other hand, Turkey has an authoritarian history. It's not like the secular governments were. Although I do think he's now exceeded the bar they had set. But that point kind of brings me back to Egypt, which is the importance of distinguishing between, the Islamist party showing itself to be distinctively illiberal within its society, and just a society that is broadly illiberal by virtue of its history. I mean, as you said, those poll numbers show, there are lots of people in Egypt, especially these days, who aren't saying they're part of the Muslim Brotherhood, and yet the polls you cited show broadly illiberal values. And for that matter, the very repression of the Muslim Brotherhood now has the support of a lot of non-Islamists, and that is itself illiberal, right? It seems to me hard to, again, I'm just wondering if you're not being too essentialist, kind of, in attributing things to the Islamist part of the Muslim Brotherhood that in fact are reflective of the society broadly.
Right, but that's sort of part of my argument, that the Brotherhood is not this group that is on the fringes of their society. They're reflecting something that's deeply held in these societies. So, whether we look at Gallup, Pew, Zogby, whatever, we usually see in a country like Egypt, more than 70-80% of the population supporting a central role for Islamic law, either as the primary source of legislation or the only source of legislation. So, even liberals do, in a kind of vague sense, they're okay, at least in a country like Egypt, with Islam playing that prominent role, or at least they feel they have to say that because of the conservative nature of society. So we have to understand it in that broader context, that even non-Islamists, and many non-Islamists voted for the Muslim Brotherhood, they are not necessarily, there's broad support for Islamism in the sense of Islamic law being more front and center. So they have, so I guess what I'm saying is, I don't see these societies fundamentally changing when it comes to their relationship with Islam and Islamic law. So for the foreseeable future, not just Islamist parties, but any party that is democratically elected has to in some way respect those popular sentiments and reflect them in public policy. And in the book, I cite briefly the example of Malaysia, which is quite interesting, where you have an ostensibly secular ruling party, UMNO, which UMNO is supposed to be secular, but it actually has Islamized considerably in terms of its rhetoric and even its policies, because they want to win over conservative voters. Because the median voter isn't necessarily in the center in these societies. And that's, I think, the key distinction between what's happening or what has happened with Islamist groups and Christian Democrats or socialists in Western Europe. Christian Democrats and socialists had to move to the center because their natural constituencies were a minority in their societies. There were only so many social conservatives in Western Europe. If you wanted to win an election, you had to go beyond your natural base of support. So you also have to look more generally at the electoral distribution in these countries. So in, I would say, the US or Western Europe, it's kind of an upside down bell curve where there's a lot of people in the center. But in the Middle East, you have a lot of people who are on the right of this kind of secular Islamist spectrum.
An interesting thought experiment, seems to me, is if the coup had not happened in Egypt, there were going to be parliamentary elections before terribly long, I think. Morsi's power per se would not have been threatened because it was not a presidential election for a while. But there were going to be parliamentary elections, I think, in a few months. Presumably, his party would not have done well, given the level of discontent, whether it was because of the economy or whatever, right? How do you do you not think he would have responded pragmatically to that and tried to shift with the? I mean, what do you think would have happened? I mean, you were against the coup, I know, and so so what do you think would have happened if things had played out and say the U.S. had been able to step in and forestall the coup, or for some other reason it hadn't happened?
So yeah, I mean, look, the Brotherhood, by its very nature, is a pragmatic organization. They're always willing to make compromises if they see that in their organization, if they see that being in their organization's interest, right? Mm-hmm. But that pragmatism is a little bit different than whether you're Islamist or not. I mean, the Brotherhood could conceivably be more Islamist than it was, but be pragmatic when it came to certain accommodation with the deep state or something like that. So I think we have to separate this notion that pragmatism and moderation are the same thing. They aren't necessarily, although they could be.
Right.
But I do think that the Brotherhood wasn't going to do as badly, at least in parliamentary elections, as many expected. I mean, they have a very solid base of support, and they're better at electioneering than anyone else in Egypt. And they're almost like American-style campaigners. They know how to go door to door. They know how to appeal to people in local districts and draw on those connections that they've built over decades. It doesn't mean that everyone who votes for them is Islamist, but they're just very good at mobilization. They're very good at getting the word out, especially outside urban centers. So liberal parties probably weren't going to do that well because they weren't able to build a base of support outside their strongholds in Cairo or Alexandria. Mm-hmm. So popularity isn't the same thing as doing good in elections. The Brotherhood could lose popularity, but still do pretty well, or even win a plurality. I would actually say that they were still quite likely to win a reduced plurality in the parliamentary elections because nobody does it better when it comes to election day. Mm-hmm. And if they had lost support, it's conceivable that support would have gone to Salafis or centrist Islamist groups. So it's not just Islamist parties on the right of the Brotherhood, but also on the left. So I think that we shouldn't assume too much about what would have happened. But yes, I think that the Brotherhood would have lost some support, and that perhaps could have pushed them to be more pragmatic. Or if you look at it the other way, if you lose support, sometimes you feel more under attack. You feel like everyone's against you, and that can actually contribute to really doubling down on your conservative base, because Morsi, in the months leading up to the coup, actually became more insular, more uncompromising, and actually was depending on Salafi support even more. I mean, if you recall, there was this big rally he had in a Cairo stadium about intervention in Syria where a bunch of Salafi sheikhs were speaking. It was a big controversy, but he was really trying to excite this more conservative base, whether on domestic or foreign policy. And this is one of the arguments I make is that, so there's something, the pothole theory of democracy, this idea that, if you come to power, you have to be good at fixing potholes because ultimately that's what people care about, or bread and butter, or whatever it might be. But if you actually can't fix the potholes, and in a country like Egypt, you pretty much can't fix the potholes, then there's a temptation, I think, to fall back on what you know best: ideology, nationalism, hyper-nationalism, xenophobia, whatever it might be, because that helps you distract your domestic constituency. It gets them excited, and you can actually maintain a significant level of support, even if you're not that good at managing the economy.
Which we're seeing in a secular context in Russia. I mean, it's a dynamic that certainly transcends the religious-secular divide, right?
You could even argue that we see it in the U.S. I mean, there's a whole kind of discussion of whether certain conservative voters in America vote against their own economic interests.
Right. Okay, so you think he might well have doubled down on what we might think of as the fundamentalist kind of base in American terms. The one question I have about Egypt, based on I've had a couple of encounters with Egyptians who would have been called liberals at the time of the Tahrir Square demonstrations and might still consider themselves that. But when they talk about Morsi and Sisi, it's like first of all, the level of hatred of the antipathy I hear toward the Brotherhood is really intense, but also they just seem utterly in denial about how plainly illiberally repressive the Sisi government is, And do you have insights into, I mean, there and the Sisi government, although it may be increasingly autocratic, it must have some substantial base of support. And can you give me some insight into the intensity of that support? I mean, is there something I don't understand about why so-called liberals so hate the Brotherhood in Egypt and so tolerate just the most brutal repression and don't even see it as repression?
Yeah. So, we have to be careful about calling people liberals. I mean, that's the name that a lot of people use. But yes, technically speaking, they don't actually subscribe to liberal values because presumably killing people is not liberal. Yes. That's why sometimes people might call them non-Islamists more generally, although that's not a very useful term. Or secular or whatever it might be. But many of them would still consider themselves in some way liberal, which is a contradiction, obviously, in terms of really understanding where this bloodlust comes from. And I think it really is bloodlust. And I was in Egypt just a few days before the August 14th massacre, which Human Rights Watch calls the worst mass killing in modern Egyptian history. And to kind of see people that, and like, they're very well educated, openly calling for mass slaughter. I mean, you read about that in graduate school with the rise of fascism in Europe, and, we hear about it, but to actually see people, expressing these sentiments, it was fascinating and very frightening for me. But I think we do have to understand where this comes from. It's not as if people are just crazy. There are roots to this, and, I think one of the challenges going forward is understanding where these sentiments come from. I think part of it has to do with the uniqueness of the Islamist secular divide. And again, this is one of the reasons why I'm hesitant to use the word exceptionalism, but I do think the Arab world is exceptional in the nature of this divide, at least if you compare it to what Latin America had to deal with in the 1970s and 80s. In Chile, for example, after Allende was ousted in 1973 by a military coup. In a lot of these other transitions, the cleavages are primarily economic. But what we're talking about in a country like Egypt or even Tunisia is there's a lack of consensus on the fundamentals, on the state building stuff, the meaning of the nation state, identity of the state, the role of religion in public life. They haven't worked out these really existential questions. And I think that's why there's a sense that this is a zero-sum battle for the soul of Egypt or the soul of Tunisia or whatever it might be. And what I kind of ran into in August before the Rabaa mass killing was people essentially saying, Shadi, you Americans with your democracy and your respecting democratic outcomes, we're the ones who have to live with the consequences of elections. And for us, it's about the way we live, the way we dress, the way we see our own country. So it's kind of almost metaphysical in a sense,
right? And
it's very raw. And that's why I think you see so many people who should have known better essentially making a deal with the devil. And actually, I'm starting this comparative project where I'm looking at post-coup context in comparative perspective. And I haven't found a case quite like Egypt. And perhaps someone can correct me and find a case, but I'm looking for it. Usually when there's a military coup, liberals are split. Some liberals will support the coup. For example, in 1973 in Chile, some liberals supported the coup, some didn't. Okay, there was a difference of opinion. What's remarkable about Egypt is that pretty much all the prominent liberals in the country, with literally a handful of exceptions, supported the coup. Fascinating. So there is something going on here. Is it Egyptian exceptionalism? Is there something wrong with Egypt? Or is there something distinctive about the ideological divide? Whatever it might be, it's remarkable that liberals would be that unanimous in their support of a military coup.
Right. And again raises the question of the trickiness of distinguishing between illiberal tendencies in a society broadly, to which an Islamist party is, that an Islamist party will readily accommodate, and distinctively illiberal tendencies in the party itself. So let's look at Tunisia. There, I don't know much about that, but my impression is that, as I said, in Egypt, Morsi's initial inclination was to accommodate the right, but I'm not sure he wouldn't have been willing to accommodate some people to the left if he had seen the political payoff there. I mean, we don't know, but I'm not convinced. It seems to me in Tunisia, you do have a case where the Islamist party showed itself willing to move to the left for pragmatic purposes. So I think it was willing to just kind of let go of references to Sharia in the Constitution or something, right? I mean,
yeah, that's right.
And okay, things didn't work out politically for whatever reason, but it was willing to make that kind of a accommodation, right? In that case, pragmatism was seeming to translate into moderation.
Yeah. So Tunisia is a really important case. It is still the relative bright spot. There is a democratic transition. People, for the most part, have not resorted to violence. So it's positive, but there is a darker undercurrent here. And just a minute on that. I mean, so the Tunisia's main Islamist party, the Ennahda party, made compromise after compromise. And one of the major ones was withdrawing a clause about Sharia in the draft constitution, which is remarkable. An Islamist party saying we don't even need to have a mere, even a vague mention of that in the Constitution. On a number of other clauses, they made compromises as a way to keep the secular opposition on board and to avert a crisis. So pretty much the Islamists in Tunisia were as accommodating as you could possibly expect an Islamist party to be. But what's concerning to me, and they deserve credit for that, that's what was necessary. But what concerns me is that despite all of those concessions, the secular opposition over the summer still tried to bring the government down through essentially undemocratic means by holding mass protests and threatening to bring down the entire process if the Islamists didn't give up on certain things. And ultimately, Ennahda had to step down from power. Some would say it was voluntary, and I guess it was, but others might say it was a forced exit, that they felt that if they didn't step down, God knows what would have happened in terms of an Egypt-style scenario or mass protest that destabilized the country. So I think that's really concerning, that secular attitudes to Islamists are, in a sense, inelastic. So regardless of what Islamists do, a lot of secularists will still see them as enemies, that you can't compromise with them, because they would say that deep down, they're still Islamists. They might act moderate or do the right things every now and then, but there's still that fundamental gap. That's why I think understanding that gap, which I think is based, at least in large part, on ideological differences, is important to understand, because you weren't able to bridge it in Tunisia. So the question for me would be, going forward, let's say Islamists win the next elections and the next elections after that, is the secular opposition willing to accept that? Or will there be another breakdown in political order? Because I think up until now, Islamists are part of the process in Tunisia, but they've had to give up some of their Islamism. They gave up their Islamism in the constitution drafting process. That's what the Turkish Islamists had to do. Essentially, they had to give up their Islamism in order to be incorporated into the political process.
Right.
So, first of all, is that fair? Is that sustainable? Because part of what democracy is about, I would say, is allowing groups to reflect their ideological preferences. So if the only way to accommodate Islamists is by essentially pushing them to give up some of their core beliefs, I just don't know if that's a workable solution.
Well, okay, but its failure in Tunisia does not obviously reflect on the inflexibility of the Islamists, right? I mean, that seems to me an important asterisk, right? I mean, you would agree with that, right? It wasn't the Islamists themselves that proved too rigid in Tunisia.
Yes, it was, I would say, the secular opposition.
Right.
Yeah.
So I mean, anyone who's tempted to read you as saying that, we keep seeing this hopeless rigidity, this hopeless illiberal rigidity in Islamist parties, that would be a mistaken reading, because your analysis of Tunisia is not an example of that happening. It's quite the opposite. And again, it leads to the question of, are we not talking more about the society broadly and its readiness for democracy at this point?
Yeah. So look, one of the things I'm trying to say, and it's especially applicable in the case of Tunisia, is that, look, Islamists failed to one degree or another. The Muslim Brotherhood failed. We can all agree on that. It did a terrible job governing. That was a failure. But I think the bigger failure is the inability of existing secular state systems to accommodate Islamist participation. That's the fundamental question here. Can these systems fully accommodate Islamism, not just in the short run when they're making compromises because they have to, but in the longer run when they're, I think, as is their right, reflecting the sentiments of their conservative base, mm-hmm. or trying to put forward Islamist policies because that's what they believe in. Mm. I mean, what happens then? And I just feel like these fundamental issues have not been resolved, and that's the key test going forward. It's not about Islam and democracy being compatible. What does that even mean? You're comparing a religion to a political system. No, the question for me is, how do we reconcile democracy with Islamism, or if you want to put it differently, Islamism with democracy? Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that the burden or the fault is entirely or even primarily with Islamists. No. I think that these secular state systems, liberal elites, and secular opposition groups have to be more accommodating. I know it's difficult because, if I was an Egyptian liberal living in Egypt, I'd be pretty frightened about the Brotherhood too, because you worry. So fine, they're fine for a year or two, you can live with it, whatever. Mm-hmm. But what happens 10 years or 15 years when you see more evidence of Islamization, or even certain laws that are passed that you as a liberal don't feel comfortable with?
And what are the specific worries? Sketch that out a little. I mean, is it that they will pass laws that thieves have their hands cut off, or alcohol will be completely banned? On the ground, what are what you would call the kind of plausible fears?
So part of the problem is that these are speculative fears. So it's not so much. So when I've had these conversations with liberal Egyptian friends, or so-called liberals, it's not so much about Morsi's time in power as much as it is about a fear of what might happen at some later point in the future. So it's very hard to have a reasoned debate about that, because you're arguing about something that may or may not happen in the future. Right. So people can think whatever they want about the future, especially if they're paranoid or they see this as an existential battle. But I think that some examples of this are, I think the bigger issue is kind of intangible, is this issue of, is the state going to be promoting a certain conception of religion? Is Al-Azhar the leading Sunni Islamic institution of higher learning and scholarship in Egypt? What happens if Al-Azhar is influenced by Islamists and it begins to play a different role and encourages these more, Islamist or strict interpretations of Islamic law? So there's that kind of side of it, of the very identity of the state, the nature of the state. That's just a general kind of metaphysical fear. But more specifically, I think, I don't want to play into stereotypes. For some people, there are concerns about banning alcohol, although that's probably not the most major thing. But again, I mean, things that may seem small, but I think are important symbolically when it comes to gender relations, gender equality. I mean, the Brotherhood, as its official position, does not believe that a woman should be head of state. That obviously frightens people. The Christian the Christian minority feels threatened,
Mm-hmm.
will they be able to build churches or have autonomy as a community under brotherhood rule? Again, a lot of these things we can't really play out. We don't know for sure.
Well, certainly a long history of Islamist rule going back about 14 centuries suggesting that, yes, it's possible for Christians to have churches in Islam, right? I mean, but anyway.
Right, but I guess I'm talking more about like, it's all a continuum.
Sure,
Are we seeing certain kinds of restrictions? What happens if the Brotherhood is in charge of a cabinet ministry and they try to segregate in their own ministry? That happened in 1991 in Jordan when the Brotherhood, as part of a coalition government, controlled 5 ministries. A big controversy then was at the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Social Affairs. There was segregation within the ministry, or there was pressure on women to wear the headscarf. So it doesn't even have to be about enforcing Islamic behavior. It's a sense more, do you feel comfortable in your own country, or do you feel that people are pressuring you to be something you're not?
Right.
Are you going to feel like there's more pressure on you to wear the headscarf if the Brotherhood's been in power, or if you want to get a job and someone in a Brotherhood ministry is interviewing you?
Yeah. Okay. I guess I still say that it seems that the story of Tunisia and Egypt is, at least to some extent, a story of the relatively secular elements not giving the Islamists the time for us to really find out what would happen, But for them not being liberal enough to, in a way. But I, So we've been talking. Well, I could talk a lot longer, but we do have to call this to an end at some point. I had said I'd ask you at the end to explain why, notwithstanding parts of your argument in this book, you still favor encouraging democracy. Pretty much everywhere, but certainly in the Middle East. Before we do that quickly, does this have any implications for Hamas, the kind of a relative of the Muslim Brotherhood? It looked like they were going to have a chance. They won an election some years ago. I thought they were going to actually get a chance to govern. And I noticed that right out of the election, their leaders were saying some relatively moderate things, it seemed to me, but they didn't get long to really express themselves. That experiment was kind of cut short. Does this? I don't know if you get into Hamas much, but is anything to say on them?
Yeah, sure. So on Hamas, certainly when it came to their openness to some kind of accommodation with the idea of a two-state solution, you do see an evolution in their rhetoric after they were elected in 2006. But I'm not talking, I don't think it's hard to talk about what's moderate and not moderate when it comes to foreign policy, because then we're judging other societies according to American national security interests, and that's a bit confusing. But I would say that if you look at Hamas, because they have been in charge of Gaza for many years now, you see a kind of veering to the right, that observers would say that Hamas has implemented certain restrictions or rules, and that it's moved in that more kind of Islamizing direction. But again, I don't like the Hamas example because it's a very exceptional case. We're talking about a context of occupation with a lot of different different pressures and so on. But to kind of address your question about, I still support democracy, which I certainly do. First of all, we got a couple options here. So the alternative to accommodating Islamists, and in my view, accommodating illiberal democracy, the alternative to that is repression. And that's what we're seeing right now in Egypt. So if you don't want Islamists to participate, then you obviously have to use force in some way because they're a big part of their societies. And I think repression, first of all, I think as many people do, I have moral objections to repression as a tool. But even putting that aside for a second, repression is not sustainable. You can't destroy these groups and eradicate them. It's been tried time and time before. It doesn't work because they're reflecting something real and deeply held in their societies. So it's not going to work in the long run. And the cost, repression has a very high cost. And I'm not just talking about for Egyptians, I'm also talking about for American national security interests. Egypt now is more unstable under this repressive rule of Field Marshal Sisi than any time in recent memory. We see a low-level insurgency gaining strength in the Sinai. We see terrorist attacks in urban centers, even in Cairo for the first time in several decades, so on and so forth. So I don't think this is good for regional stability or Egyptian stability, and that's not good for American national security interests. And you don't want to create an environment that's conducive to extremism. And I worry that's what we're being actively complicit in. So I think that that's the bad option. And the alternative isn't perfect. It's an uncomfortable thing. But I think it's the best out of the available options, that for democracy to flourish in the Middle East, we have to accept some degree of illiberalism. Now, that itself is a continuum, and that is fluid. So it could be we're talking about low to high levels of illiberalism. We don't know exactly how it would play out, but I do think there has to be a readiness to accept this. I would say that I'm a small d Democrat. I put a priority on this very basic idea that democracy is about self-determination. It's about individual and collective agency, that Egyptians or Tunisians should have the right to make their own decisions, even if they're the wrong decisions. Democracy is the right to make the wrong choice. We don't have to like it. There's no particular reason why we should like it. These are their decisions. Now we can try to nudge them in our right direction once they get elected, whether it's on gender rights or other liberal values that we care about. But ultimately, we have to respect that not everyone wants to be a liberal, that other countries have a different relationship to the very idea of liberalism, which is in part a product of the Western Enlightenment or a Western-based Enlightenment. So I think we have to be aware of that cultural context. And if we're saying that Egyptians can vote, but only if they accept liberalism, then that's not really democracy, is it? So I think there's something here to be said about respecting democratic outcomes. And I've always felt, well before the Arab Spring, that this was a problem that American policymakers had. We believed in democracy in theory, but we weren't willing to accept it in practice. We have to get over this. And we have to come to terms with the reality. And I think there's something realistic and realist about that, of accepting societies. And it's not just Egypt or the Middle East. We have to deal with this in a lot of other countries. So, for example, in India, the person who's about to be elected prime minister is not just a liberal. He's also, many would say, complicit in genocidal acts against the Muslim minority. So it's not as if the Middle East is creating this new kind of, illiberal democracy is something we've dealt with other countries. Venezuela is another example. Putin, before it got much more autocratic, so on and so forth. So this is just something we have to deal with.
And also, most of these specific elements you would identify in fleshing out what you mean by a liberal have at one time or another applied to American democracy. There was a time when women couldn't vote. There was a time when you couldn't buy alcohol, time, and so on. Now, granted, it's a relatively long time scale since most of that stuff has been true, but societies evolve, and they seem to evolve faster than they used to. So,
yeah, but it's also, there's also a kind of normative philosophical question here: are there alternatives to liberal democracy? And as we all know, with Francis Fukuyama's classic article on the end of history, this was, or should have been, or was supposed to be the final endpoint of human civilization. But are there alternatives, and do other societies have the right to try out these alternative conceptions of the good?
Right.
That, I think, that's a bigger kind of political theory discussion. But I think there's something very restrictive about thinking that everyone has to stay within the confines of liberal democracy. What if there are alternatives? We don't have to like them, but other people might like them.
Right. And it's not as if our own society is so free of social pathologies that we could recommend without reservation that our exact value system be applied in every country, right? We have a lot of problems.
Yeah, and if a majority, if a very large majority of Americans all of a sudden became very intensely illiberal, they could change the very nature of the American state. I mean, we have a lot of protections against that, but correct me if my constitutional knowledge is incorrect, but if you have two-thirds of Congress and then ratified by 75% of the states, you can change the Constitution.
Right.
So you could include a constitution that bans minorities from holding high political office if you had enough people and enough support. So
Right.
you could do a lot of things. The question is there a will? Do enough people believe in these things? And how strongly do they feel about their illiberalism?
Sure. And apparently it doesn't even take a constitutional amendment to round up everyone of Japanese descent and put them in prison, as we showed.
Exactly.
As we showed 60 or 70 years. Yeah. Okay. That's kind of my point. It's all a little more relative than we would sometimes like to think. And the categories are a little more fluid or something.
Yes.
Anyway, it's a really valuable contribution you're making to the debate. I assume you're getting the attention you deserve. And congratulations on the book.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I appreciate that.
And keep talking about it, and maybe you'll come back and talk to us again sometime.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Shadi.
Thanks for having me. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Okay.